Wow, just finished Mouthwashing and what a fun game to stream. I can see why people really like it. This probably won't consume my thoughts for the next month or so.
1 day later.
Hi Daryl. Oh god, are you okay? I played Mouthwashing last night and I didn't get any sleep because, oh my god, Mouthwashing is a game. Mouthwashing? Like the dental stuff? It's a video game. Don't worry about it. I've been wanting to get into media analysis videos for some time, but didn't want to be that person that reviews media and just tears apart what I didn't like about it, call the creators nasty names, then give myself a pat on the back. I believe we could be a bit more productive with our analysis than that, even if constant negativity is what gets the views on YouTube. After all, instead of just shit-talking media we don't like, why not put that energy into also talking about how the mistakes in a piece of media could be better avoided? Maybe direct people to something better than whatever you're critiquing. Or, if I like a piece of media, why not gush about what exactly makes it effective in whatever way it does? I want to do analysis videos for stuff that stuck with me in some impactful way, and dissect what exactly made them stand out, because I find that more interesting than the rather harsh stuff that comes across my feed sometimes. This could be anything from saying why the ending of a show worked well, to dissecting why certain character arcs from a video game fell flat. I want to do media analysis videos in a way where I can talk about specific stuff in an informational, educational way, and have an excuse to discuss stuff about media that I'm passionate about, because I like rambling about my interests. Now originally I was going to make my first analysis video about Season 8 of Game of Thrones, and both talk about what didn't work out and what could have worked with what we got from previous seasons, if they had just spent a bit more time on it. But have you ever had an interaction with someone who butts into a conversation where a group of people are talking about something that they like, only to be a Debbie Downer to talk about not liking said media because someone couldn't have their own conversation with like-minded people, instead had to talk about their dislike for a piece of media in a conversation where people are talking about liking it, completely killing the vibe and causing the conversation to end because of how unnecessary it was for someone to do that? Well, don't worry about that, because doing things out of spite is one of my motivational factors for starting a project. I went, fuck it, let's make my first analysis video about mouthwashing. So here we are, and what a game this is, because holy shit, I love this game. It's such a refreshing bit of psychological horror I didn't realize I needed until I got it, and the way it balances what it tells us versus what it implies is just so good, and I need to rant about it because this game is just, I love this game! I'm going to get to it, but I want to make this video specifically about what makes Mouthwashing so effective as a story about misogyny and capitalism, and also effectively writing such well-rounded characters, in a game that I was able to beat in just under 3 hours, and while giving us the story almost entirely through the eyes of an incredibly unreliable narrator. I want to focus this video on how Mouthwashing tells its story in such a well-thought-out way. I hate it when an audience demands that a story has to hold your hand to tell you its themes. I'm thinking of shows like Breaking Bad and BoJack Horseman, where the main protagonists, like in Mouthwashing, are not the heroes of their stories, but they still are the character whose stories we focus on. Therefore, in a way you kinda have to root for them, just a little bit. None of them have disclaimers at the start of the story that tell the audience that Walter or Bojack are not good people and we should have them as role models. The creators trust the audience to understand that themselves. We'll get more into that later. Before we start, I want to give a warning. First, we will be talking about all of the spoilers for Mouthwashing and its promotional DLC for the game How Fish is Made, the last one and then another. So if you want to experience this game blind, or go play it, or watch a Let's Play, I recommend you do that before watching this video. And I highly recommend you do, because this is one of those stories where you can easily regret not going in blind. I personally knew a couple of the major spoilers of this game before going into it, and it definitely influenced my opinion about characters before actually meeting them. And I feel like this is one of those games where you could get a really good full experience if you go in as blind as possible. Second, for those who are not aware of what Mouthwashing is and the content it covers, the game and this video will be talking about the subjects of SA, suicide, murder, cannibalism, and abuse, both emotional and physical. The game itself is not super graphic with these subjects visually, but they're very prominent in the plot, so it's very unavoidable to actually talk about them. If these topics are too uncomfortable for you, you're free to skip this video and just, not watch it. It's cool. Also, I hope you enjoy the art. I am still in fact recovering from having to draw Jim Jam, and you can leave your apologies in the comments. I think it's best to start this video by explaining what Mouthwashing is and the story that happens in it. Mouthwashing is a psychological horror game following the Tulpar, a 5-person manned cargo ship in space after it crashed in an asteroid. We mainly follow the story through the eyes of the two of the game's characters, Captain Curly, who we play as through the events that happened before the ship's crash, and Jimmy, Curly's co-pilot, who takes up the role of captain after the crash left Curly incapacitated. We learn, through Jimmy's point of view, that Curly was the one who crashed the ship on purpose for reasons Curly is unable to explain himself because of the extent of his injuries. It renders him unable to talk, barely able to move, and in need of constant care due to the burns that completely cover his body. The game tends to move between both characters' point of views frequently, and although it isn't super hard to follow who you're playing as at the moment, the game jumps around the timeline in different points, depending on where you're at in the story. So I'll try to explain what happens as briefly as I can, in order, as I will be going to more depth about the story, but just to make sure we have the main order of events right. The crew of the Tulpar is made up of 5 people: Curly, the captain, Jimmy, the co-pilot, Swansea, the engineer, Daisuke, who acts as Swansea's intern, and Anya, the ship's medic and the only female character in the game. They all work for a space delivery company called the Pony Express, which delivers cargo on incredibly long voyages. We'll be getting into them later, so I'll only cover that for now. The earliest point of the story, we start with Anya doing a psych eval for Curly. She does this with all the members of the crew, but she points out in Jimmy's case that he doesn't take this seriously and makes uncomfortable remarks towards her during it. Curly offers to do it for her, and after some hijinks involving Daisuke and Swansea, Jimmy and Curly go off to do Jimmy's psych eval. After the eval, Curly gets news from corporate that the rest of the crew will be let go after their current voyage. But hey, at least they'll still be paid for this one, right? Curly breaks the news to the rest of the crew during his surprise birthday party, who, understandably, are upset with the news, but Jimmy even more so. Sometime later, Anya breaks into the cockpit and tries taking the carrying case that held the ship's only gun, and manages to hide it. When Curly asks her why she did it, assuming she's having a breakdown, she tells him she's pregnant and reveals that it's Jimmy's, heavily implying that he assaulted her and that she has previously told Curly about it, who did not believe her when she did. She later tells Jimmy and reveals to Curly that it did not go well, and she does not want him around her anymore. Curly goes off to confront and comfort Jimmy, and Jimmy flat out asks him, what if the tragedy with the last voyage of this crew wasn't that he molested his co-worker, and then they all got fired, but rather, it was that they all died instead. So we find out Jimmy changes the route that the Tulpar is on and purposely crashes the ship into the asteroid. Curly finds out and tries to prevent it, getting burnt alive in the process, and spends most of the rest of the game in the medbay in the state we are first introduced to him in. Jimmy breaks into the cargo hold at Anya's suggestion, looking for any helpful supplies, only to find out all the cargo they were carrying was just mouthwash. The crew tries and fails to cope in their situation with little food, almost as little oxygen, and down a crewmate by drinking the stuff to cope, just because it contains enough alcohol for them to get drunk off of it. Things go from bad to worse when Anya locks herself in the medbay with Curly and refuses to open the door. At Jimmy's encouragement, he and Daisuke drug Swansea so they can get access to the hatch Swansea has blocked off, finding out that Swansea was hiding a working cryo chamber in the process. Daisuke gets injured trying to get into the medbay and discovers that Anya has killed herself via overdose. Jimmy tries to fix Daisuke's wounds with mouthwash and it does not work, so Swansea decides to put him out of his misery and kills Daisuke by putting an axe to his face. Jimmy finds where Anya hid the gun and uses it to kill Swansea. Jimmy then proceeds to throw himself a birthday party, making Curly cannibalize his own leg, that puts Curly into the cryo chamber, turning it on just before he kills himself. The game ends with us in Curly's point of view, waiting to see if the chamber turns on before it does start up, putting Curly into cryo sleep. The game ends with no clear confirmation if Curly will ever be found. It's not a long game, but there's so much more to that good narrative stuff I adore that it's so hard to pick just where to begin with it. That summary was very brief and definitely overlooks a lot of the main things that do happen in the game, so I'm going to have to break it down to explain exactly why I think this game is such an effective piece of narrative. So I think I'm going to start with the characters and with Pony Express first. So I'm going to talk about both Daisuke and Swansea. Swansea is an ex-alcoholic who got sober and turned his life around, getting a job at the Pony Express, while Daisuke is a self-proclaimed screw-up who is made to get his internship by his mother. But despite not wanting to be there, Daisuke does try so hard to do his best. He clearly admires Swansea and is hesitant to do things that he explicitly was told not to do because he has a tendency to not do things right. This admiration for Swansea was used by Jimmy to easily convince him to crawl into the dangerous vent that he was told not to go through, and Daisuke gets injured because of it. Swansea's a bit of a hard ass. He gives Daisuke a hard time, but he clearly cares about the kid. I was going to say that he only really shows it near the end of Mouthwashing, but you can see it in Curly's parts of the story too, especially in the scene where Daisuke gets stuck in the installation and Swansea has to get him out. or he asks Curly to get him out. Although Swansea is gruff and sometimes dismissive of Daisuke, he does try to teach him how to do his job. He leaves Daisuke notes about telling him not to go to do certain parts of the ship, not to touch broken things, etc. And the fixing of the cryopod at the end of the game was another one of Swansea's acts of showing that he cares about Daisuke. He knows he didn't want to be there, and fixing the cryopod was his way of trying to give Daisuke a chance of getting rescued. He thinks he's the most deserving of it. The kid didn't even want to be in this tulpar, so why does he have to die in space? I really enjoyed Swansea's monologue that he gives with Jimmy, especially highlighting how much of a piece of shit and a coward Swansea thought Jimmy was even before the events of this game. But to me, the monologue also reads more as someone who regrets not giving Daisuke more of a chance and of being dismissive of him. He calls him a ray of sunshine and says that he had a lot that he could have taught Swansea. And yeah, Daisuke is a bit of a screw-up, but he's a people pleaser and he's doing his best. A ray of sunshine that was snuffed out too quickly, if you will. Daisuke is young and he has his whole life ahead of him, and Swansea describes as his life already have crossed the finish line, leaving the best days of his life in drunken stupor for the expectations over normalcy over a nuclear family. Swansea knows what he is, but the voices of his regrets for not protecting Daisuke, especially by not protecting him from Jimmy. Hell, even Swansea says the cryopod was for Daisuke, not for Swansea like Jimmy originally assumed. Swansea sees Jimmy for the coward he is and assumes that after Jimmy kills him, he'll use the cryopod for himself, which is a fair assumption to make considering the kind of person Jimmy is, and he's right for it. Swansea thinks he's not that much better, but he at least has had to recognize that for himself. Whereas Jimmy is blinded by his own delusions of him believing not only that he himself has been a victim this whole time, but he is also going to be the hero in this story. But this leaves Daisuke and Swansea with a mentor-mentee, an older generation, younger generation relationship that is just so interesting to see, but one that never gets to be what it could have been. Daisuke tries so hard to do what Swansea says, and Swansea fails Daisuke by not giving him a chance, not sticking out for him, from keeping secrets, and assuming that it's better to keep his plans to himself than share them with the person that they were for. And in the end, he's alone and ends up getting killed by the only person on the ship who he sees worse than himself. It's just such a fascinating relationship between these two characters, even though I'm on the opinion that they don't show up as much as the others, but it's such a well-written piece of writing an older character, younger character, mentor-mentee relationship. And it's just so tragic, the relationship with these two characters, where it's Daisuke believing the whole time that he's just as much of a screw up as he believes he is, that his mother thinks he is, and just the fact that everything has gone so bad because he did not want to be there the whole time. And Swansea, knowing he should have done better by Daisuke and failing to do so, and having that horrible regret, especially since he is the one that puts Daisuke down at the end. It's just, it's so good. It's so good. And I'm not just talking about Jimmy being such a piece of shit so much because I personally don't like him. He genuinely is awful, but I don't think he's the only villain of this game, and there is even one that is a bit bigger that lurks in the shadows of the events of Mouthwashing, even if they're not entirely the reason to why these characters are in the predicament in this first place. Mouthwashing also takes a look on the failings of capitalism through its story without always focusing on what a crappy company the Pony Express is. Pony Express is a horrible company. I've been describing it as Space Amazon going bankrupt. It takes collective punishment as a way to punish employees for not doing what they're supposed to. There's posters everywhere telling crewmates what to do, what not to do. One of these rules that they have is that they're not allowed to rest for more than 5 hours at a time, which is incredibly criminal for an almost year-long voyage. Imagine being told that you're only allowed to sleep for 5 hours a day. The psychological implications of that is horrifying. The trips that these employees are sent on are ridiculously long, and they're only allowed to celebrate one person's birthday a whole time on the ship. And keep in mind, at least when we get to one scene, the famous Dead Pixel scene in Mouthwashing, we're told that there's at least another 8 months of their voyage left. Imagine being on a crew with people and having to designate a day to celebrate everybody's birthday because they're only allowed one birthday party a whole almost year-long trip. Again, they are out there in space for a long time, but entertainment and celebration and even rest are minimal under the crushing hoof that is capitalism. And it's most prevalent, about how it affects the characters in this game with just their goals. Again, Swansea is an ex-alcoholic who sobered up and got himself a nuclear family life, but he finds the alcoholic years to be his happier ones. Anya was trying to save money to get into medical school, but is unable to complete it 8 times. Jimmy is implied to struggle to hold a job and seems to get into trouble often enough, as especially noted by Curly. And Curly himself seems to be the only one who really has it made, but he doesn't find his position or privilege to bring him any real satisfaction. And it's not really hard to note how Curly's position gives him some power over the crewmates. There are a lot of things on the ship that only he has the clearance to access, such as some of the obvious things like the cargo hold and the ship's weapons, but also smaller things like the ship's sweetener supply. You have to have the captain's permission to have sugar. Only the captain can make the cake for birthdays, implying that even birthdays, on some level, have to be approved by the captain, and it just feels incredibly unfair. Especially after everyone is going to get let go once the ship returns home, and Curly is the only one with any real easy prospects of getting a good job afterwards. Swansea just accepts it, Anya panics, Daisuke is silent, and Jimmy lashes out against Curly. When one person holds so much power over you because of their class, but he fails to recognize that Curly is not much in a different position. If anything, Curly is like the Space Amazon version of a head manager. Yeah, he's got power and responsibility, but that responsibility can bite him in the ass when he has to choose between being a leader and being a friend. He gets benefits from his place as captain, but he's the first line of defense his higher-ups use to deflect their responsibility to their employees and for their employees' happiness and anger towards the company's choices. Curly doesn't get a say in it, and his bosses can avoid the nastiness of experiencing their employees' dissatisfaction firsthand. The ship also seems to be falling apart, and Polle Express is noted to be going under. Wonder why? But it still acts like a living presence in the characters' lives. It doesn't value its employees or their safety. It even makes me wonder how they would have reacted to Anya's assault if the company wasn't already going under. How they could have gotten away with any kind of responsibility since they're technically going bankrupt. Anya even reveals that the sleeping quarters don't have locks, only the cockpit and the medbay do. I want to talk about Jimmy and Curly more, but I'm going to instead talk about Anya first because one, she is involved with a lot of what I talk about with Jimmy and Curly, but also because she deserves her own section in this video. I adore her. She needs everything to be better for her. I love Anya so much. For one, I am not in the opinion that Anya is a bad nurse. And the biggest thing we have to remember about Mouthwashing is that a lot of what we're seeing of the story is through Jimmy's eyes. And one of the things that the game makes very, very clear early on is that Jimmy does not care at all for Anya. He's very dismissive of her. He basically picks at the fact that she technically is not a nurse, that she's only there because she passed the classes that the Polle Express has for their nursing, and he makes so many jabs at her. And let's not forget the fact that he assaults her, and just, I'll be going into that, but that man pisses me off in regards to Anya. And yeah, we do see some sections of the game through Curly's point of view, but opinions and thoughts about certain characters and their situations are primarily made by Jimmy. And we know that Jimmy has a huge disregard for Anya. He practically treats her like an object more than an actual person. And when she dies, he doesn't even acknowledge her death, really. I don't think Anya is a bad nurse because she failed medical school. Medical school is hard, and from what I know about American colleges at least, incredibly expensive. It's not unlikely that if she's paying for school out of her pocket, that she had to drop out when the money ran out. Depending on where she goes for school, credits could just not transfer, or requirements could have changed, and that is very likely too, since she has taken at least a couple of trips on the Tulpar in order to pay for school. She mentions previously celebrating a birthday party for Swansea, so that has to imply that she at least has been on one trip on the ship already. And she got through the Polle Express's nursing classes, which I don't know how much of that I would say would imply that her skills are really good because of how Polle Express is already. As I said before, they are not a good company. But the biggest testament to Anya being a good nurse is the fact that Curly is still alive after his accident, months after the crash. Mouthwashing constantly reminds us that supplies on the ship are incredibly low, especially medical supplies. And Anya even had to ask Jimmy at one point to take a little risk to the hull to get a medical box covered by installation because she ran out of Curly's medication and she knew there was still some out there. All Anya had to save Curly with were medkit supplies and painkillers, and she manages to keep him alive for about, 4 months, I think. Curly is not in a good condition at all. If you have played the game or have seen pictures of Curly, he's very easy to recognize. He's missing all of his skin, he has no eyelids or lips, he is missing his hands and feet. In real life, it takes a full team of doctors to take care of actual burn victims, and Anya has managed to do it by herself with minimum supplies, all while in the middle of a ship crash, and all while pregnant. And I think that's a bigger testament to her being good at what she does, and her not having the degree to prove it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that she's bad at her job just because she doesn't have a degree. She just has lack of funds to get the piece of paper that affirms it. She also is the first one to suggest going into the cargo hold for supplies to see what is in there and if there's any food or medical supplies that they may be carrying that they could use. She's the one to point that out because of the mouthwash's sugar concentration. It's useless as a disinfectant, which Jimmy ignores, and in the 2 days before the crash scene with her and Curly, she's the one that points out the dead pixel on the weather screen. She's observant. She can see things. She can notice stuff. Jimmy fucking pours mouthwash on Daisuke's wounds. The pixel scene is especially important. She's the one that notices it. Curly can't even find it. I'm going to come back to this scene later because I do want to talk about that scene more, but I had to mention it because I just don't think Anya is as dumb as a character that I've seen some people suggest she is, because of her med school status, and she deserves all the credit she could get because she is certainly not going to get it from some of the members of this crew. She's observant and funny and a great person to be around, and she just suffers for having Jimmy being the eyes that we see her story through. I also think she's one of the better written examples of a character who went through sexual assault than some other characters who may have had discourse made recently about their good or not good SA rep status. Anya's character isn't just about her assault, but we also get to see the kind of person she was and how Jimmy affected her. Anya's character isn't just about her assault, but we also get to see the kind of person she is without Jimmy's presence, and how Jimmy affects her when she has to be around him, rather than her character being just reduced to the victim. Nor is the assault downplayed at all compared to the rest of the events in the game, and in fact, I would go as far to say it was the key event that started the path that mouthwashing goes down on. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. I also wanted to note something about the DLC for How Fish is Made, where they have multiple fish you have to collect before you go and collect Curly. One of a lot of the people that I have seen talk about this DLC kind of point out how a lot of these fish seem to represent the crew members, which I do agree. The very first fish is very narcissistic and reminiscent of Jimmy. The second one that you meet is very just kind of boisterous, kind of seems out of it, like Swansea is near the end of the game. But one of the fish that we do run into is in this very somber area. It's a fish that's on a hook and is attached with the umbilical cord to another fish that's like a little baby fish. And unlike all the other fish that we do meet in the DLC, we don't actually get to hear this fish talk. It's a very quiet, somber scene, and all you could do is grab the baby fish. You don't even grab the parent fish it's attached to. And I think that it's another way that this game shows how horrifying what happened to Anya was, in such a way that is very shocking when you come to it without having to be super graphic. It's just overall very well done in general. Now, we're introduced to Curly as he was before the crash, and before the crash, Anya, is cracking jokes, they're gossiping, and they get along well. Whereas while we first meet Anya in the game through Jimmy's point of view, Anya's nervous and avoidant, her word choice is more reserved versus her more open, gossipy personality around Curly, and what we hear about how she interacts with other characters such as Daisuke. Now at the point where we get our first introduction to Anya, her assault already has happened, and the game doesn't tell us exactly when Jimmy did assault her, but even before that first introduction, back when Curly was having his psych evaluation, she mentions how Jimmy makes her uncomfortable, via telling Curly he won't take the psych evaluation seriously, and on the last one she gave him, he made comments about being aroused by cartoon horses. Can't believe Jimmy X Polle is canon. And before the bad news from corporate, she jokes around with Curly and the crew. She gets into heated arguments about board games with Daisuke, and even trusts Swansea enough to tell him about what Jimmy did to her, even if he does not end up doing anything about it. I love Anya as a character, and I wish we got to spend more time with her outside of playing as Jimmy, but she is also such a heartbreaking character because of how much she was failed by Curly. And that is what I really love about how Mouthwashing writes the relationship. And before I go further into this, I don't ship the two of them. I don't ship anybody in this game unless it's Jimmy X Prison Time, which is the only ship in this game that I feel like is valid. But let's get back to talking about Curly and Anya because these two make my heart hurt. Now, Curly and Anya were good friends, and the game focuses a lot on their relationship with each other, about as much as it does with Curly and Jimmy's relationship. But I think through their interactions with each other, we also see that trust start to fall to pieces, starting with the conversation during the dead pixel screen. Anya points out a dead pixel on the screen and how it always is in the back of her mind, while Curly has trouble finding it and calls himself someone who always sees the bigger picture. That lies with Curly's biggest problem. In his relationship and friendship with Jimmy, he refuses to see what he really is. He doesn't accept that Jimmy would do anything like assault Anya, and doesn't believe her when she first told Curly that he did that. And we also see her lose her trust in Curly significantly, as shown when she steals the gun case and hides it. That at first, Anya was trying to use the gun to hurt herself because of the bad news received by corporate, and feels upset that he never considered that maybe she also needed psychological evaluations. But then she tells Curly that she's hiding the gun from Jimmy, specifically because she is pregnant. She doesn't trust Curly not to give Jimmy the gun if he asks for it, and even if Curly denied that that's true, considering his previous interactions with Jimmy in the game, I think he eventually would have given him the gun if he made it sound logical enough, or maybe if Jimmy berated Curly into doing it. And this is the first time Anya tells Curly that she is pregnant, and Curly still didn't want to believe that Jimmy would assault her. But he is forced to accept that Anya is telling the truth. And after she tells Jimmy and it doesn't go well, he doesn't ask her how she's doing. He asks about Jimmy, and leaves Anya alone to go see Jimmy and go check up on him. She asked him what he would have done if she had told him she was stressed earlier. He said anything, but ended up doing nothing at the end. Curly is told through the game by Jimmy that all the stuff that has happened, specifically all the bad stuff Jimmy does, or bad stuff that happens to the crew, mostly because of Jimmy, was Curly's fault. In a way, he kind of is right, but not in the way that Jimmy thinks he is. Curly is not responsible for Jimmy's actions, but he is responsible for making sure that those actions do not result in harm to the rest of the team. Curly should have stepped in sooner to stop Jimmy's harassment and behavior towards the rest of the crew, before it escalated to the point that led to Jimmy literally trying to kill them all. Curly's biggest failure was how he was not there for Anya, and his failure in helping her, both as the captain of the cargo ship and as a friend, led to the disaster in the end. I really enjoyed Curly as a character. I think of all the characters in this game, he was my favorite, although Anya is a very close second. She deserves everything. But Curly hits a particular bit of character writing I myself have been messing around with, and the reactions from fandom about his character have been interesting to see. I love it, and it's so fascinating to study in terms of character writing. Nothing I'm personally writing involves some experiences that the characters in Mouthwashing are going through, but I have thought a lot about why Curly sticks in my head compared to the others, and I think the reason as I landed onto that is because he reminds me a lot about a bunch of my own characters I'm writing about, and kind of the stories and the thoughts that I'm trying to convey to people and trying to get people to think about. I also don't want to spoil some really good stuff I have planned for my own webcomic. Wink! I, of course, am going to voice my own opinions about Curly, as my opinions about video game is what this video is about, but other people's opinions about his character were interesting to read nonetheless. That being said, I personally don't think Curly is a bad person. Especially with the current internet media literacy, people tend to have reactionary black and white thinking to things. And considering how badly he failed Anya, I agree. He messed up horribly, and his enabling of Jimmy's behavior, even if it was unintentional, had a massive impact on what led Jimmy to try and kill everyone on the ship. But I don't think that makes him a bad person. Flawed and enabler, yes, but nowhere near as the same level as the kind of bad person that Jimmy is. People are more complicated than just good and evil, and I don't blame anyone for disliking Curly because of his inaction, but I disagree that he's evil because of it. Curly to me seems like someone who is very conflict avoidant and very much not necessarily a people pleaser like Daisuke, but more or less almost in the same kind of vein. He looks out for his crewmates, yes, but he doesn't make the best decisions for their overall happiness and safety. Curly tells them about Pony Express going under because he hates keeping secrets from them, but fails to recognize the consequences of telling them. He clearly cares for both Anya and Jimmy, but doesn't do anything to, in his eyes, disturb the peace, choosing Jimmy, his longtime friend, over Jimmy's victim. And I think that deep down, subconsciously, Curly knows what an unstable individual Jimmy is, and tries to lead a situation in a way that won't set him off. Not to get too into my own personal history of previous abusive relationships, but as somebody who has lived with someone who's at least as violent and reactionary as Jimmy, I can understand why Curly would focus more on how he thinks he's trying to keep the peace, instead of confronting Jimmy for assaulting Anya and addressing this issue at hand. It's a way emotional abuse can be, focusing on calming down the abuser before there's an escalation, even if it negates solving the actual issue at hand. Now, that does not justify his actions at all, but I can understand why he may have not wanted to have done anything that could have made things with Jimmy worse, especially after the news about the whole goo being fired happened so shortly before Anya found out she was pregnant. And we see how Jimmy decides to react to that. Jimmy was Curly's friend, and Curly did care about Jimmy. He even went so far as to get Jimmy a job at Pony Express, despite being a troublemaker back on Earth. It is horrible to realize that maybe someone you're friends with actually just really sucks. And with the fact that they were supposed to be stuck with each other for another 8 months at the time that the accident happened, and with being captain of the ship, Curly not wanting to start conflict with Jimmy is understandable, even if it's not the best course of action. Maybe not even possible with the situation Pony Express leaves the Topar on. They are on a voyage for another 8 months. They have no way of locking people up. The sleep rooms do not have locks. The only locked areas are the cockpit and the med bay. So they couldn't have just locked Jimmy up. But Curly could have made some uncrossable boundaries that he could have set in place, and Curly failed at it. And what I'm trying to say is I believe Curly's inaction was not done out of malice towards Anya, but rather because of the connection he has with someone he's close with, and in this case, Jimmy. And the fact that he knows that, even if he won't admit it, that Jimmy is an incredibly unstable individual. It's partially codependency, partially just trying to help, and partially just being part of an abusive friendship. And it's not like Mouthwashing doesn't point out that the situation the characters find themselves in isn't at least partially Curly's fault. He even is punished for it before the game starts. Now, I want to say I don't believe that the punishment Curly got in Mouthwashing for his enabling and inaction was becoming disabled. There are burn victims and people who went through accidents that have left them disabled that lead full lives, along with what limitations their disability may bring them. And even if you don't believe me, Mouthwashing takes place in a supposedly futuristic world, judging by the fact that they have space travel. You cannot tell me that Curly would not have been able to get prosthetics or skin grafts after his accident if he returned to Earth. I mean, Anya kept him alive for months after the accident with nothing but a med kit and painkillers. He could have very much easily have returned to society as an independent human being. I also just hate using disability as a punishment, and what I like about Mouthwashing is that the game doesn't go, Curly enabled Jimmy's behavior, therefore the story will punish him by maiming him. I also want to talk about how Mouthwashing talks about disability, because what happened to Curly really sucked. But I think to me, it's less about what happened to him, and more so with how he is treated after his accident. Not that it all is negative, Anya seems the most sympathetic to his condition, but is unable to help him the way he needs her to. Curly is left dependent on Anya's care, but she can't stand the sounds he makes when he has to take his meds. It's not a pleasant sound, but I think it has less to do with just the noises, but also with the loss of consent. Curly can't say anything to the others. He can't tell them to let him die, keep the medicine for themselves, or to warn them about Jimmy, or essentially anything. He's at the whims of what the crew decides to do with them, still talking about him, but treating him more of a chore rather than a human person sometimes. There's one point in the game where Curly is left crying and moaning loud enough for the sounds to echo through the ship, but are ignored until Jimmy asks about Curly's medicine. Then he's treated as a punching bag immediately afterwards by Jimmy. It hasn't also failed to me that Jimmy implies they voted on eating Curly at the beginning of the game when the food runs out. I mean, the game has cannibalism after all. The comment did not escape me when he first said it. Curly suffers for his inaction at events prior to the asteroid crash by being in a perpetual state of inaction afterwards, and unable to act against Jimmy for the safety of his crew or himself. Look at what happens after the crash. Jimmy continues to verbally assault and emotionally abuse Anya through the game. Jimmy gets Daisuke mortally injured by convincing him to go through the vent. Jimmy drugs Swansea and then kills him after Swansea mercy kills Daisuke. Jimmy even goes as far as to take his own anger towards Anya out on Curly and physically assaults him at least once when giving him his meds, and possibly other times in the months since the crash. We just don't see everything that happens. Unless we be reminded of Jimmy forcing Curly to eat his own leg that one time. This idea is specifically solidified to me near the end of the game. At one point, Jimmy goes looking for the missing gun after Anya and Daisuke's deaths, and he finds it in the medbay, right next to where Anya's dead body is, which happened to be under the bed Curly was laying on. When Jimmy gets the gun, Curly begins to laugh, then sob, but only after Jimmy grabs the gun. This moment in the game happens shortly after we found out Anya has stolen and hidden the gun case, revealing to the audience Anya's pregnancy from Jimmy's assault, and to me it makes it clear that Curly has made the realization about Anya being right. He couldn't have kept Jimmy from getting his hands on the gun after all. The last one and then another also shows us insight into Curly's thoughts about Jimmy, even if he's not mentioned by name. These don't read as the same Curly before the crash, but someone who recognizes how much at fault he is as Jimmy was. Curly really tried with Jimmy, but in the end it doomed them all. He let him get away with too much and refused to see his flaws. Honestly, Curly Mouthwashing is one of the only few characters in any media where I can, confidently say his biggest flaw is being too nice. If Curly just fucking decked Jimmy the moment Anya told him that Jimmy assaulted her, Mouthwashing would have been 10 minutes long at the most, and they could have gotten home, made my favorite Mouthwashing ship of Jimmy X Prison Time canon, but unfortunately, all we can do is stream in this situation. Which I guess means now we have to talk about Jimmy. I don't really know how to go about it. So I think we should start with all the list of pros about Jimmy, and then we'll go on to the cons, starting with pros. Pro number 1, Jimmy is a very well-written character, as an example of a dure antagonist whose own failings in a story are his fault, and his fault alone, and the perfect example of a character who is an unreliable narrator. Now that we got to the list of pros out of the way, let's get to the list of cons. One of my regrets with not going into this game blind was that I already knew a lot about what happens in the story before playing Mouthwashing, and I do regret it because I would have liked to have seen what my opinion about Jimmy would have been like if I didn't already know that he assaulted Anya, and is the main reason to why everything in Mouthwashing is so fucked. I think it influenced a lot of how I felt about Jimmy throughout the game, which makes my main argument about Jimmy's arc seem biased. Not that I've seen a lot of people disagree, but I honestly think that the game does a sound job by itself to support my opinion, so I doubt it's that. The game introduces us to Jimmy, and right off the bat shows his dynamic with the crew, specifically with Anya, who he belittles and shows little sympathy for. Not surprising considering what we learned about him later in the game, but it doesn't paint him much in a good light, tainting his supposed calm collective new captain persona with how he treats his crewmates. Mirrored by Curly's introduction, where he acts like both a friend and a captain, making sure that Swansea is being careful to ship's hull and not letting Daisuke cause more accidents on the ship, doing Jimmy's psych evaluation when he won't cooperate with Anya, and just generally getting along with the crew. But we also get introduced to the beginning of Jimmy's one-sided conflict with Curly. The fact that Curly has a job that is stable, a crew that admires him, and basically has it made in terms of having a stable life, versus Jimmy's implied unstable life, getting in trouble on Earth, at least before Curly got him the job at Pony Express, then learning that Curly isn't even happy with his status, something that Jimmy is incredibly jealous of. One of the things that we learned about Curly is that he's not satisfied with his position at Pony Express, but feels as if he has to stick with it because he technically has made it. And he does. Ron Organ even confirmed that after their last trip, Curly was going to be the only member of the Tulpar who is going to receive commemorations from Pony Express, while the others would not. Curly was still going to lead the life of basically an upper-level manager and leave his old crew behind as he continued up the ladder of his own success. Now, I don't think that Curly would do that to his crew. I can imagine if things in Mouthwashing went differently, Curly would try to help out his coworkers by giving references, maybe possibly pulling strings like he did for Jimmy at Pony Express. But Jimmy doesn't see it that way. And we see that reaction from Jimmy at Curly's surprise birthday party, claiming that Curly was glad to wipe his hands clean with him, and he can now continue on past the speed bump that was where he currently is in his life. But even before that, we see a glimpse of this jealousy from Jimmy, who during his psyche eval says he finds it really annoying that everyone on the ship keeps talking about how good of a captain Curly is, and repeating the sentiment after he blames Curly for Anya getting pregnant, apparently, despite Jimmy being the one that assaulted her. Is it very obvious that Jimmy has a victim complex yet? I think at this point everyone could understand that I think Curly is a complex character who leans more towards the morally gray than strictly good or evil. But let me make it a little bit more obvious that Curly is my favorite character for a moment and talk about how him and Jimmy's friendship is just Jimmy is such an absolutely shitty friend towards Curly. I don't think Curly letting Jimmy on the ship was a good idea. Not just because of the kind of person Jimmy is, but also because of how Jimmy doesn't even bother hiding how much he resents Curly. Yeah, Curly is his best friend, but Jimmy's language he uses towards Curly is very emotionally manipulative and borderline abusive sometimes. Having someone on board who treats their good friend like that for a long period of time isn't healthy for either of them. A lot of Curly's dialogue towards Jimmy is concerned, but also de-escalative. He tells Jimmy that they could do anything together, they could fix anything, and has major concern for Jimmy's emotional state that he doesn't have for the rest of the crew. Not because he cares, but Curly has gotta know, at least at some level, that Jimmy is emotionally unstable, and even if he refuses to see that Jimmy is not a good person, he has to know that at some level. It makes me think Curly has seen Jimmy's worst side before. Maybe not in the way that he has in Mouthwashing, but in some way where he has to put Jimmy's feeling before everyone else in order to make sure Jimmy feels seen and heard, and to make sure he doesn't lash out and get into more trouble. That's not a friendship. That's basically a codependent hostage situation, one in a way that they both suffer from. Jimmy's own resentment towards Curly hurts himself, and Curly's own stubborn desire to believe that Jimmy can be better causes him to become one of the main outlets of Jimmy's anger. And we end up hearing what that sounds like when Jimmy's given a target who can't defend himself from his anger. We don't know exactly what trouble Jimmy has gotten into in his past, but at least seems to be bad enough that Jimmy has had to have trouble finding stable work afterwards. And it seems to me Pony Express was a company that didn't really do thorough background checks on people that they want co-piloting their ships. We see Jimmy painting himself as a victim through his life circumstances. But a lot of what happens are the consequences of his own actions, and the events of Mouthwashing shows us that. Jimmy accuses Curly of wanting to get rid of them, instead of getting mad at Pony Express for laying them off. Jimmy assaults Anya, and his response for getting caught was to blame Curly because he's captain, and he should have been more responsible. Jimmy crashes his Tulpar onto Wake Rock, and then avoids accountability by blaming Curly when he's too vulnerable to defend himself. Jimmy manipulates Daisuke into climbing into the incredibly dangerous vent, and dumps mouthwash on his wounds. His idea of saving everyone and fixing things was to kill Swansea, cut off Curly's leg, then feed it to him, and at the end of it, still couldn't even take responsibility for the fact that him assaulting Anya and not accepting the consequences of that was what doomed him in the first place. And I find that fascinating as a character study, even if Jimmy is gross and I hate him. It's interesting to see through the eyes of someone who spends the whole story considering himself the real one who is suffering, and still completely misses the point of why all this happened in the first place. We see characters like that in stories like BoJack Horseman and Breaking Bad, but rarely in the character's exact point of view, where we're given biased information right at the beginning because our protagonist still believes, despite being the one who caused everything, that he still is the hero. Mouthwashing for the most part is a critique on essay culture. And you know what word I mean, but unfortunately YouTube hates that specific one, so I have to call it that. The main conflict in the story starts because of Jimmy's assault on Anya, and what happens is a result of that, but it also is a discussion of conflict avoidance, inaction, and of accountability. We see that part of the story a little through Swansea, who does nothing about Jimmy after Anya tells him about her assault, but mostly through Curly, someone who failed his crew because he refused to see that Jimmy, his friend, a person he did so much for because he cares about him, would do something so horrible. And in ways, a lot of us could relate to that. Maybe not from the same circumstances as the crew of the Tulpar, but haven't we all had that one ex-friend who was toxic in some ways? Or maybe you have that friend now, but you just don't know it, or don't want to accept it. Or, you know, that friend who, they may have some issues, but they're not that bad, right? They're my friend. If they do something horrible, maybe even forgivable, would you hold them accountable? After all, they're your friend. Your friends can't do bad things, they're your friend. The phrase takes responsibility is repeated throughout Mouthwashing, and by the end of the game, Jimmy has had his big realization. He needs to fix everything. He did this. He has to take responsibility. He should do the noble thing, right? He takes Curly, puts him in the only functioning cryopod, then turns it on and kills himself. Curly has a chance to be found and saved, and Jimmy won't cause problems. Jimmy took responsibility, right? He's a hero. Except that he didn't, and Mouthwashing tells you so. Jimmy has multiple scenes of the game post-crash where he is having conversations with Curly, but these are hallucinations. These are going through Jimmy's head. Curly can't talk. We know that the words he's saying are words that Jimmy is putting in his mouth. One thing he recognizes in his last hallucination of Curly is that Curly would be the one to take the fallout for Jimmy's mistakes, making it seem like he is happy to do so. After all, Jimmy's his friend, and Curly has always been there for him. Jimmy feels guilty about it, and attributes his taking responsibility to saving Curly, giving him a chance because he suffered from Jimmy's mistake, and he's the only one left. Which is all fine and dandy if it wasn't much more complicated than that. Because there's one thing Jimmy never takes responsibility for in Mouthwashing, and it's the main reason why the events of the game happen in the first place. He never takes responsibility for assaulting Anya, and we see that in the final hallucination in the game, before Jimmy puts Curly in the cryopod, the scene with Polle. Polle is the mascot for the Pony Express, and the cartoon horse we can imagine Jimmy was talking about in his gross comments during his psych eval with Anya. Polle is presented through the cartoon images that line posters on the Topar, but also as a statue that Jimmy ends up destroying during the months after the crash in the lounging room, and as various monsters that we see throughout the game. Jimmy hallucinates the statue on the pile of empty mouthwash bottles, lecturing Jimmy on his supposed taking responsibility. The one notable thing about Polle, other than the fact that he has actual voiced lines, is the text. Character sex are represented by a color, and Polle's is blue, the same exact blue as Anya's. And at some point, we get this interaction.
Polle Says.
Which turns the background into the night sky, the very one that Anya likes, with the dead pixel. Polle gets mad and interrupts Jimmy when he tries to use a quote Anya says to him at the beginning of her game: "Our worst moments don't make us monsters." Curly says something similar to that, and the last one and then another, saying, "We're defined by our past, but not slaves to it." This was implied to have also been said to Jimmy, although it's not repeated in Mouthwashing. It feels appropriate to mention it in this part too, especially this part because in previous scene, we just saw Jimmy say he's going to take responsibility. He knows he fucked up, and he's so sorry about it. So why doesn't he acknowledge what he did to Anya? And why is he so focused on what he did to Curly? Curly is not the one he should be apologizing to, because Curly is also at fault because of his inaction. He was responsible for the ship and the safety of the crew, and he got his punishment for failing that. He watched them all get killed by the person he should have been protecting them from. Why is Jimmy still thinking about him? I've seen people say that Polle is supposed to represent Anya, but they also think it's supposed to represent his kid. I personally don't think it's the latter, and more likely Anya over their kid, mostly because Jimmy's treatment towards her. His behavior towards her is creepy, abusive, and his disregard for her and what he did for her goes as far as him never acknowledging her after she kills herself. Except when to complain about what she said to Swansea about him. But Anya's sleeping spot was also next to the Polle statue in the lounge, the statue that goes off like an alarm when you approach it where Anya's bed is. The same statue that Jimmy ends up destroying just before Anya's death, and takes satisfaction in it. Turning Anya, in his head, into an object is very fitting for the guy who assaulted her and refuses to consider that he should be regretting it. But Mouthwashing is also a story of circumstances, the nature of living in a capitalistic society given form in a small setting and space. We know of Anya's struggle at school, of Daisuke forced to do a job he never wanted to appease his mother, of Swansea's happier yet socially unacceptable past and his current acceptable but not as fulfilling present. Even Jimmy and Curly are both victims to it, although for different reasons. Jimmy sees Curly's status as a thing of envy, something he desires but doesn't have the skills or temperament to have. Although we are not sure what trouble Jimmy got into on Earth, I personally assume it's something that at least has had a police record of sorts. Something bad enough that Curly had to pull some strings to get Jimmy as his job as his co-pilot, and I think that Jimmy resents that, and resents that Curly is not happy with the power he gets when he thinks he should. Meanwhile, Curly finds his position stagnant, unfulfilling, and desires to leave it, but doesn't have any idea what he would do without it, and who he would be without his position. He mentions it in How Fisher Made, talking about how he planned to stay at the job for a year or two, then bounce, but 1 year becomes 5, then 10, and the world has moved on without you. What are you supposed to do with yourself after sticking with one thing for so long? A game could be all of that and more, and overall this is one of those games that are going to stick with me for a very long time. Mouthwashing has made it up there in horror games I very much enjoy, and Ron Organ did such an incredible job at writing such a compelling narrative and such interesting characters. Mouthwashing may not be a long game, but video games don't need to be long to be impactful. I mean, Presentable Liberty is one of my all-time favorite games, and it's very short and simple, almost entirely taking place in one room. I also love that the game doesn't stay totally confusing despite being a psychological horror game. There are a few things that flew over my head that I didn't realize until thinking about it later, but I think if a game makes you go back and replay or even think about it for a solid 24 hours straight with no sleep like I did, then I think it did its job. Which means I believe this video is at its end, and here's for the art for it. This is definitely one of my longer ones. If you guys enjoy media analysis videos like this, please let me know what you thought about this one. I have more planned for the future that will hopefully be more specific than general analysis like this was, but I couldn't help it. Mouthwashing has so many layers, and I want to talk about all of them. I have so much videos and stuff planned for this game. I'm just gonna do exactly what I did when I got super into murder drones for a month and a half. Just draw as much art as I can, go hog wild with it, and then just be happy doing that for a bit. Now, as always, you can find my socials and other works linked below. I have a webcomic. If you like horror and want your horror with a side of queer topics, then read my webcomic In Harmony, the story of an art student returning to their Appalachian hometown for school, only to become a monster hunter with their friends instead. If that sounds cool, you can check it out on inharmony.the-comic.org, or in the link below. I also have a Patreon where I post pages early, and some art for the comic you can see before everyone else on there as well. And if you're new, feel free to leave a like and maybe subscribe. I do art commentary, story time, art tutorials, animations, podcast recommendations, and more. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you have a good one.